I stand inside Topkapi Palace as steel gates close quietly, marking succession before coronation. Ottoman chronicles describe moments when brothers disappeared before subjects ever learned their names. This story matters because it reveals how empire preserved order by eliminating uncertainty at its source. Under Mehmed II, fratricide was codified, transforming murder into law. Dawn breaks as court officials wait in still corridors, listening for confirmation rather than celebration. Ink dries on firmans authorizing death as necessity, seals pressed without hesitation. Survival depended on proximity to power, not innocence. Princes understood this before they understood mercy. Raised within guarded apartments, they learned that kinship invited danger. Bowstrings replaced debate. Silence replaced mourning. I sensed the calculated calm that accompanied these acts. Violence folded into administration. The law claimed compassion for the many, sacrificing few lives to prevent civil war. Yet each death tightened the empire grip on fear. Archival registers list payments for burials and stipends for executioners, evidence of routine rather than crisis. European envoys later wrote of shock, yet acknowledged stability achieved through dread. Topkapi architecture itself reflects this logic, with secluded chambers aligned along succession routes, spaces designed for containment and removal. Stone absorbed footsteps that never returned. I linger on the moral weight carried by those corridors. Legalizing fratricide did not end violence, it internalized it. Power learned to cleanse itself through bloodless procedure. Subjects saw order, families saw absence, the state saw continuity. Foreign chronicles from Venice and Ragusa compared these acts to storms contained within walls, unseen yet decisive. Court historians justified the policy as ancient wisdom, though its formalization was new. Mehmed II referenced necessity, not precedent, binding future sultans to his logic. Succession became an emergency rehearsed in advance. Mothers prayed in guarded rooms, knowing affection could not protect sons. Eunuchs carried orders without names attached. Judges certified deaths without trials. The palace functioned as a machine, designed to reduce uncertainty to silence. Archaeological traces of altered chambers, sealed doorways, and reinforced corridors reveal planning rather than improvisation. These spaces were not hidden accidents, they were integral. Ritual prayers accompanied executions, blending faith with command. Imams spoke of order. Soldiers obeyed without witness. Records remained clinical, listing dates and expenses while omitting faces. Violence became administrative memory, repeatable and justified. I reflect on how this system trained rulers to equate mercy with risk. Compassion appeared dangerous. Delay meant danger. The empire rewarded decisiveness even when it destroyed its own bloodline. This inheritance shaped governance long after individual sultans passed. Fear became institutional knowledge, passed through protocol rather than story. It lingered as expectation, shaping choices long before commands arrived, and disciplining thought itself within palace walls and generations afterward. This chapter introduces the central tension that shadows Ottoman rule across centuries. Did legalizing fratricide truly prevent civil war, or did it normalize violence so deeply that the empire could no longer imagine restraint? Imperial authority prefers clarity over mercy, and I feel that preference carved into Ottoman law. Canon collections preserved from the 15th century explicitly permitted the execution of rival princes for the sake of public order. This was not chaos disguised as necessity. It was necessity defined by statute. Fratricide became responsibility rather than crime, a burden assigned to rulers in the language of stability. Judges cited precedent. Scribes recorded outcomes without emotion. Ink absorbed blood before it touched stone. I moved through candlelit chambers where seals pressed into wax carried death across courtyards with administrative calm. Firmans traveled efficiently, escorted by silence and obedience. Language transformed killing into procedure. Words like order, peace, and necessity replaced names. The emotional weight rests in that transformation, where morality yielded to structure. Violence did not erupt. It was processed. Ottoman legal thinkers justified this system as prevention, arguing that one death spared many. The law offered reassurance to officials tasked with enforcing it. They followed text, not impulse. Responsibility dispersed upward and outward, diffused across institutions. When execution occurred, no single hand claimed authorship. The system itself acted. Archaeological remains of palace quarters reinforce this logic. Isolated rooms near succession routes show planning rather than improvisation. These spaces were designed for containment, separation, and finality. Walls thickening. Where voices needed silencing. Doors narrowed where hesitation could not be allowed. Architecture cooperated with law. I reflect on how legality reshaped conscience. When murder becomes lawful, objection becomes insubordination. Mercy appears reckless. Restraint looks like weakness. Officials learn to obey without reflection, trusting statute to carry moral weight. The ruler signed because the law demanded it. The law existed because fear demanded certainty. Foreign observers struggled to comprehend this order. Venetian reports describe astonishment at a state where killing followed procedure more closely than justice. Yet they also noted results. Succession crises were brief. Rebellions rare. The empire endured. That endurance became justification. The unresolved tension deepens here, tightening like wax cooling around a seal. When violence becomes lawful, who is accountable for its consequences? The ruler whose hand signs the order, or the system that demands the signature before mercy can speak? Princes were raised knowing affection carried risk, and I trace that knowledge through the Ottoman court like a shadow. Education trained sons for rule while surrounding them with reminders of mortality. Court manuals emphasized discipline, vigilance, and silence. Childhood unfolded within guarded apartments where tutors measured loyalty more carefully than curiosity. Sound carried differently in palace corridors, footsteps echoing lessons children understood before they could name them. Foreign ambassadors described anxious households in letters sent back to Venice and Vienna. They noted boys separated early, kept apart to prevent alliance and shared identity. Brothers became distant figures, potential rivals defined by proximity rather than bond. The emotional core lies with children taught that love endangered survival. Tutors praised obedience. Affection was corrected. Trust was postponed indefinitely. I imagine lessons conducted beneath painted ceilings, where history offered warnings rather than comfort. Stories of fallen princes circulated quietly, shaping imagination through absence. Tutors emphasized vigilance, reminding students that hesitation invited death. Even games carried caution. Play ended quickly. Laughter softened. Silence prevailed. Venetian correspondence reveals the mini truth beneath formality. Princes were deliberately isolated, rotated between quarters, denied continuity. This was not neglect. It was strategy. The state shaped rulers through controlled fear, believing preparedness required emotional distance. Compassion appeared dangerous. Brotherhood seemed unstable. Architecture confirms this design. Separate chambers, layered gates, and limited shared spaces prevented familiarity. Archaeological surveys of Topkapi residential wings revealed deliberate compartmentalization. Walls taught lessons words reinforced. The palace itself participated in education. I linger on the cost. An empire demanded stability yet cultivated suspicion in its heirs. Boys learned governance alongside grief they could not express. They mastered control before empathy. Power replaced kinship. Fear replaced trust. This open question persists, unresolved and heavy. How does an empire expect stability when its future rulers are shaped by fear rather than trust, trained to see family as threat and mercy as liability? I walk behind silk curtains where executions rarely spilled blood. Ottoman practice favored strangulation, often with silk cords, to avoid public spectacle and preserve ritual composure. Death occurred in sealed rooms, framed as mercy rather than punishment, framed as order rather than cruelty. Court records justify the method as dignity, insisting that absence of blood spared the condemned dishonor, yet absence never lessened finality. Torchlight flickers across tiled walls as doors close with controlled final sounds. Bowstrings were chosen for softness, not kindness, selected to leave no visible mark. Eunuchs and officials performed these acts without witnesses, trained to move quietly and withdraw without comment. I feel the weight of choreography designed to make violence invisible. Killing became procedure, rehearsed and contained. Ottoman registers record expenses for cords, burials, and prayers with identical detachment. Names vanish after brief notation. The emotional weight centers on ritualized killing designed to appear controlled, as if restraint redeemed intent. Mercy was claimed through method, not outcome. The condemned were denied voice, struggle hidden behind fabric and tile. Archaeological analysis of palace layouts reveals hidden chambers aligned with succession routes, narrow rooms accessible only through guarded corridors. These spaces were not improvised. They were planned, reinforced, and acoustically isolated. Architecture absorbed responsibility. Stone walls ensured silence traveled inward, never outward. I imagine the moment before restraint tightened, breath measured, ease fixed on patterned tiles meant to distract thought. Prayer murmured by others replaced any spoken farewell. The act concluded without spectacle, leaving no stain to confront. Officials resumed duties immediately, as if order depended on speed. This concealment shaped memory. Subjects knew outcomes without seeing cause. Fear functioned without images. Violence deepened because it left no evidence to challenge. Concealment preserved imperial dignity publicly while hardening cruelty privately. Compassion had no space to intervene. Court historians praised discretion. Foreign observers struggled to reconcile civility with disappearance. The empire relied on silence as much as force. I stand in these imagined rooms sensing how restraint became mask. The unresolved tension sharpens with every quiet corridor. Did concealment preserve imperial dignity, or did it allow cruelty to deepen unseen? I reflect on how ritual language softened responsibility, allowing participants to claim obedience rather than choice. Each execution reinforced hierarchy, reminding all that order survived through unseen acts. The palace continued to function, its fountains running, its kitchens active, while lives ended quietly nearby. This separation trained officials to compartmentalize conscience. Violence became background noise, tolerated because it was hidden. Such systems endure not through spectacle but through routine, repetition, and silence, leaving future generations to inherit stability built upon rooms designed for forgetting. These spaces taught obedience long after witnesses departed, and records pretended nothing occurred there. I read foreign dispatches thick with disbelief. European envoys from Venice and Vienna described Ottoman fratricide as calculated barbarism masked by law. Their letters, preserved in state archives, carry controlled outrage intended for private eyes. Bells rang across cities celebrating treaties, while ambassadors wrote of brothers disappearing behind palace walls. This chapter examines outsider perspectives shaped by distance and diplomacy. What Ottomans framed as necessity, outsiders named cruelty. Venetian Bailo reports describe executions conducted with efficiency that unsettled observers accustomed to public spectacle. The emotional angle rests on contrast between moral revulsion and political admiration. Stability impressed even as conscience recoiled. I follow correspondence noting how succession crises ended quickly, without armies mobilized or cities burned. Efficiency muted criticism. Ambassadors recorded horror, then acknowledged results. The mini reveal appears in reluctant praise of order achieved through fear. Words like effective and decisive appear beside barbarous and inhuman. Sound traveled differently across borders. In Istanbul, silence followed execution. In Europe, bells announced continuity. Distance softened judgment. Rulers weighed ethics against advantage. Trade continued. Alliances held. Outrage remained ink, not action. I consider how empire success disciplined foreign criticism. When outcomes favored stability, protest lost urgency. Diplomatic necessity eclipsed moral challenge. Outsiders adapted language, condemning practice while negotiating benefit. Witnesses became complicit through pragmatism. The unresolved question remains heavy within these documents. Did foreign outrage matter at all, or did imperial success silence criticism through results alone, teaching observers that order, however achieved, justified restraint and quiet acceptance? Archival marginalia reveal hesitation scratched beside official summaries, evidence that disbelief persisted beyond polite phrasing. Some envoys warned their courts that methods shaping obedience might one day shape resistance. Those cautions were noted, then ignored. Power rewarded predictability. Moral discomfort rarely altered policy when commerce flowed and borders remained stable. I sense the fatigue in later letters, outrage dulled by repetition. Violence normalized through distance. Foreign courts learned to speak softly while benefiting loudly. The empire performance disciplined international response. Success reframed brutality as cultural difference rather than crime. Observers adjusted expectations, accepting internal methods they would not tolerate domestically. This accommodation reveals how fear travels unevenly across borders. The silence of outsiders became another pillar supporting the system, reinforcing the lesson that results outweigh methods in the calculus of power. Through this exchange, condemnation survived only as commentary, never intervention, proving how distance, interest, and success combined to mute outrage, until brutality felt inevitable, procedural, and unworthy of confrontation, even as witnesses understood its cost, but chose accommodation over resistance quietly, repeatedly, deliberately. I stand among the ruins of Topkapi Palace, where fratricide left an imprint beyond individual deaths and taught the empire that stability justified erasure. Silence still clings to stone, lingering in corridors designed for obedience rather than memory. I speak here not to judge a single ruler, but to trace how repetition hardened policy into identity. Succession remained orderly, yet compassion narrowed, shrinking with each generation trained to equate mercy with danger. The emotional afterimage lives in institutional memory shaped by fear. Ottoman governance prized continuity above all else, and continuity demanded certainty. Princes became variables to eliminate or contain. Officials became instruments who executed law without reflection. Over centuries, this logic seeped into administration, diplomacy, and culture. Violence did not need to announce itself. It was assumed, anticipated, internalized. I walk past foundations where chambers once isolated heirs, and I hear absence louder than testimony. Archaeological surveys reveal reinforced doors, narrow passages, and secluded quarters aligned with succession routes. These stones confirm what texts imply. The palace was built to manage bloodlines as threats. Architecture served ideology, ensuring that hesitation had no space to breathe. Even reform adopted this grammar. The caves preserved bodies while breaking wills, proving that restraint could still wound deeply. Court historians celebrated endurance. The empire survived crises that shattered rivals. That survival became proof of righteousness. Yet endurance carries hidden costs. When rulers learn governance through fear, policy becomes defensive, suspicious, and inward-looking. Creativity suffers. Trust evaporates. Authority persists, but legitimacy thins. I sense this erosion in later records where surveillance expands and innovation contracts. Foreign observers admired stability while misunderstanding its price. European courts negotiated with confidence, seeing continuity as strength. They rarely asked what was sacrificed to achieve it. Success shielded the system from scrutiny. Results silenced critique. Fratricide receded from view not because it was forgotten, but because it had done its work. It taught the empire how to endure without dissent. The human cost remains difficult to measure. Lives ended without record. Survivors lived without voice. Mothers vanished from chronicles after sons disappeared. Brothers became memories that could not be spoken aloud. This silence compounded across generations, shaping emotional norms within the ruling class. Compassion became private, dangerous, and suspect. Public virtue aligned with severity. I reflect on how law reshaped morality. When killing is framed as duty, refusal appears treasonous. When mercy threatens order, cruelty becomes respectable. This inversion outlived the practice itself. Even after fratricide waned, its assumptions lingered. Control remained preferable to trust. Containment replaced execution, but fear remained the organizing principle. Standing among these ruins, I recognize that legacy is not only what endured, but what was lost. Humanity narrowed as power consolidated. Stability demanded sacrifice, and the sacrifice was intimate. An empire survived by destroying parts of itself repeatedly, believing that loss was manageable if order continued. This chapter reflects on legacy rather than verdict. The system endured, expanded, adapted, and ruled vast territories. Yet endurance alone does not equal justice. Longevity can mask harm. Silence can appear as peace. I hear the echo of choices made quietly, rationalized thoroughly, and repeated until they felt inevitable. The emotional weight lingers because this logic is not confined to one empire or era. It warns how institutions learn to survive by disciplining empathy. When systems reward certainty over care, humanity becomes expendable. The stones around me hold that lesson without inscription. The final open loop remains deliberately intact, unresolved by ruins or records. When power survives by destroying its own bloodline, what kind of order is truly preserved? I do not close this reflection with certainty. I remain attentive to the way such systems educate successors long after laws change. Institutional habits outlive statutes. They persist in hiring, training, and reward. In the Ottoman case, fratricide ended formally, yet its logic shaped governance through suspicion and containment. The cage replaced the cord, but the lesson endured. Stability required control of bodies and emotions alike. I think about how memory is curated. Official histories praise order and expansion while minimizing internal costs. Archives favor decrees over whispers. Ruins preserve walls, not hesitation. This imbalance teaches later generations what to value. When cruelty produces results, it is rebranded as necessity. When mercy risks uncertainty, it is dismissed as weakness. Such reasoning travels easily across time and place. The palace environment trained officials to read silence as safety. Decisions occurred away from crowds, reinforcing the belief that power works best unseen. This preference influenced taxation, military command, and provincial oversight. Centralization thrived. Local initiative declined. Governance became cautious, reactive, and inward. Empires can survive this way, but they rarely flourish creatively. I also consider the victims whose names remain unrecovered. Some died quickly. Others lived confined lives defined by anticipation rather than action. Their experiences rarely shaped policy discussion. They existed as problems to solve, not humans to understand. That reduction made repetition possible. Once a life becomes a variable, elimination feels efficient. Standing here, I recognize parallels beyond history. Modern institutions also reward certainty, speed, and control. They often struggle with ambiguity and empathy. The Ottoman example offers no simple lesson, only a warning etched in stone. Order achieved through fear carries a hidden debt. It accumulates quietly, shaping behavior long after its origin is forgotten. This debt surfaces when adaptability is required and trust is absent. At that moment, systems discover what endurance has cost. It influences succession planning, crisis response, and ethical imagination. Leaders inherit reflexes without context. They repeat solutions because alternatives feel unsafe. History then appears cyclical, though causes differ. The ruins remind me that durability alone is not virtue. Without humanity, order becomes hollow, resilient only until pressure demands creativity it cannot supply. That failure defines the true legacy measured long after crowns vanish, and walls crumble beneath time and memory itself alone.